Okay, so you've got these tutoring sessions coming up, and you're kind of a little afraid about what to do about expectations. We didn't used to have this slide in this presentation, but it came from my favorite seasoned tutor, Mr. Deek. He works with something like 35 high school students, and he tutors algebra and geometry and trig. And he found that basically, and I think this is a little more true with middle and high school students than elementary, that you have to go in with expectations that they're going to respect the fact that you are giving up an hour that you could be studying, or you could be hanging out with your friends, or you could be Facebooking, or you could be writing that paper to come there and be with that student. And you're going to drive, so it's going to take up some of your time. It may take up some money. So we want them to respect your effort, and it's okay for you to say that, and that you expect participation in return, and that you're not a mind reader. So if you're sitting in the session and your student is just, doing this, you have to say, look, we will be much more successful if you are willing to tell me what you're struggling with or how you're processing this problem than if you sit here quietly or act very distracted. So it's fine and appropriate to establish some of that up front and that you expect some effort. Mr. Deek has a great icebreaker that I think I would suggest all of you try. He goes in and he says, okay, we're going to have this session, and at the end of it, I want you to grade my performance on whether you learned something and whether you enjoyed the experience. And this is not a big deal for a college student. You get to rate the teacher all the time. But for an elementary or a middle or a high school student, that's a rarity. And it also, I think, turns the tables where they feel like they have sort of some authority in the section, and it also makes them think about how well you're doing. And if you're honest about it, you want that feedback. You want it to tell you what worked in that session and what didn't. And Mr. Deek always said that the kids always gave him a much better grade than he would have given himself. And when he asked them to score their participation, they always score it lower than he would have given them. But it's kind of a good icebreaker. It's a good way to get feedback on how your tutoring session is going, and it also helps you, again, to establish connections with your kid. You want to try to make it exciting. You don't want to try to replicate what exactly is happening in the classroom. We survey our kids at the end of the year. They always say they want it to be more fun. They also want you to bring cookies and cakes and snacks, but they usually just are looking for it to be a little bit more fun and engaging. So how do you get the most out of this tutoring session? Now, if you're tutoring middle school kids or high school kids, you're going to have an hour. If you're tutoring elementary students, you're going to have them for 30 minutes, and you'll work with 2 kids during that hour. Well, the first thing to do to get the most out of your tutoring session, because it's such a limited amount of time, is to get to know your school. And each school has a very different way of handling their volunteers. So you want to scope that out the minute you get there. But the biggest high loser is getting your student and getting started. So what you really want to do is to try to figure out with the school the fastest way for you to get your student and get to the tutoring room and get started. Some schools will have the student waiting for you in a waiting area. Other schools will show you where your student is the time that you come in, and you will pick that student up there and go to the tutoring room. If you can at all possible, it's especially valuable if you're working on the elementary level, because most elementary students have 1 teacher or maybe 2 teachers. That's a better way to go, because it may give you a window of opportunity to talk to that teacher briefly about how your student's doing and what they might want you to focus on. Typically, if you're picking up a middle school or a high school student, they could be coming from any class, and most likely not the class that you're tutoring them in. So you won't have that advantage. But you want to figure out how to get them as soon as possible and get them to the tutoring space. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when I tutored at Circles of Success Learning Academy, I would pick my student up on the ground floor, and we had to walk up 2 flights of steps, go down a really long hallway, and then another hallway to get to the tutoring room, which when you're walking with a little 1st or 2nd grader can eat up a lot of time. So if you're in that situation, to your advantage. do multiplication tables or addition facts, or ask them their spelling words while you're going over there. But make use of the time that you're together because it goes very quickly. So you want to establish that routine for meeting your student. You want to only tutor in designated areas. We built this program with safety in mind. The safety of the students and your protection as well. That's why we do the fingerprint scan background checks, and that's why we ask each school to designate particular areas to tutor. They need to be spaces that are highly trafficked, so that you may be in a classroom, but there's going to be students and faculty members walking back and forth. You don't want to be isolated out in a hallway where you don't see anyone. You definitely don't want to be in a building that is not a main building, like maybe it's a facility that's a gym area. If you find yourself in a position where you don't feel like there is a lot of activity, mention that to the site coordinator, because you want to be in a space that is very, very integral to the part of the school. I'll give you a perfect example. I had a tutor, went through this training session, was told to do in the designated areas. He's working with a group of writing students, small group, like 4 or 5 kids. He said, you know, why don't we go to the library? Well, this happened to be in a school that shared a facility with another school, and the library was not their library. It was actually the other school's library, but the kids thought this was a great idea, so they took them to the other school's library. Well, 2 minutes into the session, the whole school was going crazy. Where did this group of kids go? Because they were not in a designated area. So please make sure that you only tutor in the spaces that your school shows you. Once you get into your tutoring space, you want to limit distractions. And you could be tutoring in a room like this. Probably not stacked like this, but in a room this large that might have 6 or 7 tables with a couple of pairs of tutor and students at them. So you really have to scope out your space and figure out, how can I limit the distractions for my students? Now this is a tough one. If I was in here with a student, I would certainly make sure that we don't look at the window, because they're going to be looking at the window any chance they get if you're facing that way. I would most likely set myself up so that I had a table or chair that was facing that wall or this wall. Because if you have pairs, you might have a little 7th grade boy who's got a big crush on that 7th grade girl, and if they're at tables where they're facing each other, you're going to be losing the kid's attention. So really look at your space and figure out how to focus your student the best way you can. I had a school where we had to tutor in the hallways. And I had some really savvy tutors that would pick the top of the stairwell, where there was about a 2-foot by 2-foot area for a chair and a desk and a flat wall, and that's where they would tutor. But you want to do that as much as possible. When you go in to do your tutoring, now some of you will be incredibly overachievers, and you will get on the internet the night before and you will look up some games and you will find some worksheets, and maybe you have some old flashcards from when you were in middle school, or you might go to the tutoring room and come up with a whole bunch of things. So if you bring all of that stuff in and you set it on the table, let's pull it right there. No matter what you pick, this one, they're going to want this one. Pick that one, they're going to want this one. So you have to make it a little bit theatrical. All of your stuff underneath the table and bring it out one by one, so that they always are interested in what's coming up next. They'll have your full attention and their full attention when you're working on this piece. And I'll talk about this a little more. You want to vary your delivery method and your pace and what you're doing so that it is constantly engaged. So you might want to start out with flashcards, and then maybe you're going to go to that worksheet. And then maybe if you're in a room that's got a whiteboard, you get them up on the whiteboard. If you're in a space that you've got a pretty good soundproof area and you're working with younger kids and you want to do math drills and you want to do jumping jacks with them, you can do all of that. But again, bring it out one at a time so that it's exciting. There's something upcoming next. This is an obvious one, but I didn't do it right when I first tutored. Oh, I'm going to be a tutor. I go in and I'm like thinking, okay, I'm going to sit across the desk like the teacher. Well, yeah, that makes me feel good, but it's really not that effective. What you want to do So you want to sit side by side. Because all of a sudden, when you're sitting side by side, you're a team. You're a partnership. And it's also a heck of a lot easier to read the math problem or the storybook if you're both looking at it from the same angle. So do that. You'd think it would be obvious, but I sure didn't do it at first. It also really helps reestablish that connection. And as I was mentioning before with this example, break your work into manageable pieces. You may get a teacher who gives you a worksheet that has 40 problems on it. Yeah, a middle schooler that's having trouble with that particular math skill to begin with, and they see a page with 40 problems on it, they're going to go, ah, and you're going to lose them. What you do is you put a piece of paper over those 36 problems and you start with 4. And all of a sudden that becomes a more manageable task. It's something that they can see the end to. And in reality, when you're working on a particular math skill, if they go through those 4 problems very carefully and they write out what their thought processes were, you will get a lot out of that. There's a thing if you're an elementary tutor called the Dolch 200 words. It comes in a page this long with 5 or 4 really long columns. I was a first grade tutor, man, I want to make sure that my kid knows all those 200 words. So I would go to poor Lewis and I would say, okay, Lewis, we're going to go down this huge line of words before we start anything else. And Lewis always hated when I did that. And it's because it was an overwhelming list. So what I would do is I would break it up to 3 words at a time, and then 3 more, and then 3 more. And we would whip through it by doing it that way. But if you overload them or overwhelm them with a huge amount of things to cover right at once, they will really be upset. So break it into manageable pieces.